But I'd mentioned before, like hitting a gnarly season of depression. And when that happened, there are a lot of things I did to get healthy again, hitting it from every angle to work through that. But it lasted for like a solid 3 months and then a couple of months of pretty severe anxiety. And I had a month of vacation saved up I could utilize. But I was still pastoring a group of people, of students, during that stretch. After a month, I came back and was still not well for several months. And when I had to re-engage with the group, I told my wife, I'm more afraid of what I could become if I can compartmentalize this and get in front of people and be whole and well and polished and have them think I'm good while feeling like I'm dying inside. I'm more afraid of what I could become if I do that successfully, like looking ahead in years or decades. If I can compartmentalize and do this, what could I become in the future? That was more unnerving to me than standing in front of people in vulnerability and wiping a couple of tears and saying, I'm a shell of myself today, but I'm holding on to hope and holding on to faith that Jesus is good, even though I'm hurting and have never been in this place before. So as my wife and I, after a month off, when we were talking about re-engaging, we had talked about how if we were going to re-engage and if I was going to get back into a pulpit, it needed to be that I would teach and lead going forward with a new level of vulnerability that would let people see my woundedness, and then that would let people see where God was healing that and restoring that, which was painful and uncomfortable for me because I'm more of a private person. Sure, yeah. But even like it was sermon series during that stretch of time. It was like doing a sermon series on Christ wanting us whole, not just healed physically, but the shalom, like us being whole and emotional health. It was doing a series on forgiveness on the heels of that and letting people into some of my journey as God was walking me through things. And it's dramatically shifted, I think, the way that I talk to people. I mean, I was sharing with you yesterday and your wife that I had shingles in the fall because of, yes, church things, but someone in our family had suffered a mental health collapse. And I mean, we stayed with friends and in a hotel because of death threats and quite the gnarly stretch. And then they were in jail. And then when they got released, they needed me to help them to get situated. And so I had shingles break out. And I got in front of the church and with permission from my wife for sure, but got up and shared like, this is what I'm personally carrying. And I haven't carried it well. And because of that, like I've dealt with some severe anxiety in this stretch and I need to manage this better and humbly confess to you that I've not honored the Lord and taking rest because I've been too arrogant. And I've not managed my stress well because I've tried to carry it rather than casting cares on him, and talked through it with the church. And so I've had to learn that I need to be willing to expose enough of my humanity to where I feel uncomfortable and know that some people won't like that. But if I'm not sharing enough that I'm uncomfortable, I don't know that I'm sharing enough. So I'm okay with letting people see that I'm just human. I get to be their pastor and shepherd and teacher, which is a gift and privilege. But I'm okay with them seeing that I'm still a frail human who deeply needs the love and grace of Jesus and who leans on the grace of Jesus. So I don't just expose my vulnerabilities. I'm always going to expose them in the context of talking about the grace of God being sufficient for those vulnerabilities. So it always goes back full circle to that.
Feel that you've ever overshared?
Oh, for sure.
And what happens after you out?
Beyond the self-loathing? I think there have been moments in time where I've overshared, and you learn the lesson early with your wife that like, oh, I get permission for anything that involves her, that kind of thing. So I've done that in the early years, but I do think there are moments where I realized I'm bleeding in front of these people when I should be probably sitting with a counselor, a therapist, or a friend. Because I think we've probably all sat and listened to somebody get in front of a crowd of people and share things. And at least for me, I'll sit there and think, I think what you need today is not a pulpit, you need a friend. And I don't know that the pulpit should be utilized as a close confidant and friend for you to offload these things and process. So it's one thing to verbally process in front of a crowd of people about your emotion or your hurt. I think it's a very different thing to let them into your vulnerability and hurt and let them see just, oh, I'm a broken human who deeply needs the grace of God, and look at what God is doing in the midst of this. I might walk with a limp, and people in my church know this, that that limp is not a physical thing, but it said, I've been deeply wounded and dealt with depression and anxiety and clinical stretches. And because of that, I do walk different than I used to. But I'll tell our church, I think that limp has given me more than it cost me, though, because it's given me a real dependence on the grace and care of God. And it's also given me a deep sense of compassion for people who are hurting. I think of like in the Old Testament, Jacob and his encounter with God, where God touches his hip, and the Psalms, it mentions he walked leaning on a cane really for the rest of his life. Like he was a changed man. And that undoubtedly was uncomfortable and it slowed him down. However, the limp gave him more than it cost him, because every day he'd limp, it reminded him that was real. Like God really showed up in my life. And not only did he show up, but his promises he made. I was afraid my brother, who I was going to meet the next day, that this was the end of my life, that he was going to come after me and my life was over. And instead, God told me I had a future and my future descendants were going to be a part of his eternal plan. And that wasn't too good to be true. That was real. And my limp reminded me of God's gracious plan for the ages and that I get to play a part in it. I think the same of Paul, I've got a thorn in the flesh, but I learned through it that his grace is sufficient. His strength is made perfect in my weakness. Our people at our church would probably tell you, if you ask like about me, I would at some point, I'll bet most of them would say like, oh, and you know what? He's a guy who's been through some stuff, but God's used it to shape his heart and make him a really compassionate person, or God's used it to shape his heart to where he's drawn to people who are hurting. Or he would tell you that although maybe he wouldn't have chosen some of the things that he suffered through, that he's come to see that it gives him more than it cost him. So I think vulnerability that lets people into that journey and then invites them to bring their own woundedness to the table, I think is a gift. The like, I'm bleeding in front of you, I'm verbally processing, I can't believe I've been wounded, rejected, people, whatever, I think is messy.